Jake Carter sat in his tiny, cluttered apartment in Anchorage, Alaska, staring at the cryptic email on his tablet. It was late. The city outside bathed in a ghostly glow from the auroras overhead. He barely heard the hum of his drone, Scout 8, hovering quietly near the window. His focus was entirely on the message. They're still doing it. The laboratory, the tests, the disappearances. Go to the coordinates. Verify for yourself. Bring it to light before it's too late. There was no sender listed, no traceable metadata, just the cryptic coordinates pointing deep into the forested wilderness of Alaska. Jake's mind raced. For years, rumors had circulated about a hidden government lab that conducted illegal experiments. His father, Dr. Michael Carter, had worked on classified projects before disappearing under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Jake was no stranger to danger, having spent years working as an investigative journalist. But this felt different. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that the email wasn't just a lead, it was personal. Scout 8, an AI drone Jake had customized for reconnaissance, beeped softly. Coordinates analyzed. Estimated travel, 14 hours by vehicle, then 6 hours on foot. Weather conditions suboptimal. Recommendation, proceed with caution. Jake smirked grimly. Caution's not my thing, Scout. Within hours, he was packed. A satellite uplink, holorecorder, stealth cloak, and a sidearm he hoped he wouldn't need. The drive was uneventful, the vast expanse of forest wrapping him in solitude. By the time he reached the trailhead, the snow was falling steadily, blanketing the world in silence. The hike through the dense forest was grueling. Scout 8 flitted ahead, scanning for movement, mapping the terrain, and marking anomalies. The towering trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at the sky. As night fell, Jake finally reached the coordinates. There was nothing visible at first, just a clearing surrounded by ancient evergreens. Then, Scout 8 detected it. Faint electromagnetic signatures and a thin shimmer in the air. Jake adjusted his goggles, activating the thermal overlay. What had seemed like an empty clearing now revealed itself. A facility buried beneath the earth, its entrance hidden by advanced cloaking technology. A narrow staircase descended into the frozen ground, its edges lined with faint pulsing lights. Jake's pulse quickened. The rumors were true. This was the lab. He crouched at the edge of the staircase, the weight of what he was about to uncover pressing down on him. His father's disappearance, the whispers of inhuman experiments, the missing people. It all led here. But stepping into that labyrinth of secrets would be a point of no return. "Scout," he whispered, his breath clouding the air. "Stay sharp. Let's find out what they're hiding." With one last glance at the snowy forest behind him, Jake descended into the unknown, the chill in the air feeling far more than natural. The staircase led Jake deep underground, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. Scout 8's soft hum was the only sound in the suffocating silence, its blue scanning light casting eerie shadows on the metallic walls. As Jake descended, the stairs opened into a wide corridor dimly lit by faint, flickering overhead lights. The air smelled sterile, with a faint metallic tang, as if it hadn't been breathed in decades. Scout 8 hovered ahead, scanning for heat signatures and structural weaknesses. "No life detected within a 50-meter radius," the drone reported. "Facility appears operational but minimally staffed." Jake crouched low, his holorecorder capturing every detail. The faint hum of hidden machinery, the cold metal floors scratched with wear, the occasional faded hazard signs on the walls. This wasn't an abandoned lab. It was still active. The corridor split into two directions, each marked with old, peeling labels. To the left, observation chambers. To the right, cryostasis and containment. He hesitated for a moment, then turned right. If the lab was experimenting on humans, containment would be the key to uncovering the truth. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the faint hum of machinery growing louder. As he moved further in, the walls became lined with thick observation windows. Behind them, the cryostasis chambers loomed, rows upon rows of cylindrical pods filled with a greenish fluid. Frost clung to the glass, distorting the shapes inside, but Jake could see enough to make his stomach churn. Humans. At least, they had once been human. The bodies suspended inside the pods were warped, their forms grotesquely altered. Some had elongated limbs, others had skin textured like bark or scales. A few had metallic implants fused into their bodies. Their faces were twisted in frozen expressions of agony as though they had died screaming. "Scout, are they alive?" Jake asked, his voice low and tense. The drone emitted a soft beep as it scanned the pods. Subjects exhibit minimal metabolic activity, state, suspended animation. Genetic analysis indicates non-human modifications. Jake's throat tightened as he filmed the pods. These weren't experiments to enhance humanity, they were atrocities. He moved cautiously down the row, each pod worse than the last. Near the end of the chamber, a terminal glowed faintly, its interface flashing warning messages. Jake approached it, his fingers trembling as he accessed the files. The records were fragmented but damning. Project Cryogenesis Objective: hybridization of human subjects with extraterrestrial DNA. Status: unstable. Subjects highly volatile. Containment protocols insufficient. Incident Report 142-B. Subject 73 breached containment. Casualties 14 personnel. Status: terminated. Jake's breath hitched. Hybridization. Alien DNA. It was worse than he'd imagined. His father had disappeared into this madness. "Jake," Scout 8's voice cut through his thoughts. "Unstable power signatures detected. Recommendation: immediate departure." But before Jake could respond, a low mechanical rumble echoed through the chamber. The lights flickered violently, and the fluid in the pods began to churn. One by one, the cryostasis chambers flickered to life, their monitors displaying warning messages. "What's happening?" Jake whispered. The drone beeped in alarm. "Containment breach imminent." A loud hiss erupted as the seals on several pods began to release, green fluid spilling onto the floor. Inside, the warped figures stirred for the first time in decades. Their distorted limbs twitched, their eyes snapping open, eyes that glowed faintly with an unnatural light. "Run," Scout 8 said. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He bolted back down the corridor, the sound of shattering glass and guttural snarls chasing him. Jake sprinted through the dimly lit corridor, his heart pounding in sync with the guttural roars echoing behind him. The once quiet lab was now alive with chaos. The sounds of shattering glass, metallic screeches, and inhuman growls reverberated through the narrow passage. Scout 8 buzzed frantically beside him, its scanners flashing red. "Multiple hostiles detected," the drone announced. "Pursuers closing at a rate of 5 meters per second. Recommend evasive action." "No kidding," Jake hissed, skidding to a stop as the corridor forked again. To his left, a sign read, "Research and Observation." To his right, "Engineering and Exit Access." "Scout, map the fastest route out," Jake barked, his eyes darting to the shadows behind him. "Exit access is compromised," Scout 8 replied, its voice eerily calm despite the urgency. "Hostile activity detected in engineering pathways. Recommend detour to research and observation for alternate egress." "Great," Jake muttered, turning left toward research and observation. His boots splashed through puddles of coolant leaking from ruptured pipes, the walls now trembling with the vibrations of the facility's failing systems. The hallway opened into a massive observation chamber. The space was lined with viewing platforms, each overlooking what appeared to be testing arenas. Jake slowed, his holo recorder capturing the grotesque remnants of experiments. The arenas were littered with skeletal remains, shattered equipment, and claw marks gouged into reinforced walls. Scout 8 hovered ahead, its lights scanning the room. "No active hostiles in this sector," it reported. Jake stepped closer to one of the observation windows, his stomach churning. Inside the arena, a massive humanoid figure lay slumped against the far wall, its body riddled with scorch marks. Its muscles were grotesquely overdeveloped, veins bulging unnaturally beneath pale, mottled skin. But it wasn't the size that unsettled Jake. It was the face. Half human, half something else. Its jaw was elongated, its teeth too sharp, and its eyes were lifeless yet faintly glowing, as though they'd never belonged to a human being at all. A plaque near the window read, Subject 42, Phase 3, Hybridization Trial. Result, unstable, deceased. Cause of death, internal genetic rejection. Jake felt bile rise in his throat. These weren't just experiments, they were abominations. The government had crossed a line, playing God with alien DNA. He recorded everything. Every detail burned into his memory. Jake, Scout 8's voice interrupted, multiple signals approaching from behind. Estimated contact, 30 seconds. Jake spun around, raising his flashlight. At the far end of the hallway, shadows shifted unnaturally. The snarls grew louder, guttural and primal. Up there, Scout 8 said, projecting a beam toward a metal catwalk that circled the observation chamber. Jake scrambled up the ladder to the catwalk just as the first of the creatures burst into the chamber. Its body was a grotesque fusion of human and alien features. Elongated limbs, translucent skin stretched tight over exposed muscle, and those terrible glowing eyes. It sniffed the air, its head jerking toward the ladder Jake had just climbed. Stay low, Scout 8 advised, its light dimming to avoid detection. Jake crouched behind a support beam, his breathing shallow. The creature prowled the floor below, joined by two others. They moved with an unnatural, jerking rhythm, their heads snapping in random directions as they searched. Jake's fingers hovered over his sidearm, but he knew better than to fire. The sound would draw more of them. He turned to Scout 8. Find me another way out. The drone beeped softly, scanning the catwalk. Maintenance hatch located. North end of the catwalk. Leads to upper levels. Jake crept along the metal walkway, the creatures below snarling and clawing at the air. His every movement felt agonizingly loud, the creak of the catwalk seeming to echo endlessly. He reached the hatch and yanked it open, the rusted hinges protesting loudly. Below, one of the creatures let out an ear-splitting roar, its glowing eyes snapping upward. "Move, Jake!" Scout 8 urged, hovering into the hatch ahead of him. Jake pulled himself into the cramped maintenance shaft just as the creatures leapt onto the catwalk, their claws scraping against the metal. He kicked the hatch shut, his heart hammering as the beasts slammed against it from the other side. He didn't wait to catch his breath. He crawled forward, the narrow shaft barely wide enough to accommodate him. "Scout, where does this lead?" "To the experimental labs," the drone replied. "But be advised, facility-wide lockdown imminent." Jake cursed under his breath. If the lab locked down, there would be no escape. The narrow maintenance shaft stretched endlessly, every clang and hiss of the lab's failing systems amplified in the confined space. Jake crawled forward, sweat dripping down his face despite the freezing air. Scout 8 hovered just ahead, its scanners mapping the labyrinthine route. "Structural integrity of the facility is declining," Scout 8 warned, its voice calm despite the chaos. "Recommend reaching the experimental labs before full lockdown." "What happens during lockdown?" Jake asked, his voice strained as he squeezed through a tight bend in the shaft. "All entrances and exits sealed. Ventilation systems reconfigured for neutralization protocols," Scout 8 replied. "Neutralization protocols?" Jake froze, his breath catching. "Gas dispersal to eliminate intruders and compromised subjects." Jake swore under his breath. He wasn't just racing against the creatures now, he was racing against the facility itself. The maintenance shaft ended abruptly at a grate. Through it, Jake could see a sterile, brightly lit laboratory. Rows of equipment lined the walls, and holographic displays flickered faintly, projecting incomprehensible diagrams. The room was eerily quiet, untouched by the chaos of the lower levels. Jake pushed the grate aside and dropped into the lab, landing with a soft thud. The room smelled of chemicals and ozone, sterile yet somehow oppressive. Scout 8 buzzed forward, scanning the area. "No hostiles detected. the drone reported. "This lab appears to have been recently active." Jake moved cautiously to the nearest terminal. The interface blinked to life, displaying encrypted files. His fingers flew over the keys, bypassing the outdated security protocols. What he found made his stomach churn. The files detailed the lab's purpose. Project Origin: integration of alien genetic material recovered from XYZ. Objective: enhance human physiology for advanced adaptability in hostile environments. Jake's eyes narrowed as he read further. The alien material wasn't just DNA, it was something alive, harvested from a crashed extraterrestrial vessel. The experiments had started decades ago, shortly after World War II, and had escalated rapidly. The subjects, many abducted from remote areas, were exposed to the material in controlled environments. But it wasn't controlled enough. The logs detailed repeated containment breaches, horrific mutations, and escalating casualties among the lab's staff. The final entry sent a chill down his spine. Subjects exhibit signs of heightened aggression and environmental adaptation. Hostile and unmanageable. Termination protocols ineffective. Recommendation: cryostasis for indefinite suspension. "Scout, record everything," Jake said, his voice hard. "Recording initiated," the drone confirmed. He moved to a series of containment units at the back of the lab. Each was a transparent chamber filled with a viscous amber fluid. Suspended inside were things. One chamber held what looked like a child, no older than 10, its body covered in translucent scales that shimmered under the light. Its eyes were open, glowing faintly, and its chest rose and fell with slow, unnatural breaths. Another chamber held a figure with elongated limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body, its skin stretched taut over visible bones. Jake recoiled, his stomach twisting. These weren't test subjects, they were victims. "This is what they were trying to create," he muttered, a mix of horror and fury in his voice. Scout 8 beeped sharply, breaking his thoughts. Hostile signatures approaching. Estimated contact, 90 seconds. Jake spun around, his heart racing. The sound of distant snarls echoed through the corridor outside the lab. The creatures had followed him. "Options?" he asked, grabbing his holo recorder and shoving it into his pack. "Emergency escape route located," Scout 8 said, projecting a map onto the wall. "Hidden access point behind the eastern containment units. Leads to the surface." Jake ran to the eastern wall, scanning for the hidden hatch. He found a panel with a biometric lock, its surface dusty and worn. "Scout, override this," he said, stepping aside. The drone hovered over the panel, its light flickering as it worked to bypass the lock. The snarls grew louder, closer. Jake glanced toward the lab's entrance, sweat dripping down his temple. "Almost there," Scout 8 said. The lab door exploded inward, torn apart by claws. The first creature entered, its glowing eyes locking onto Jake instantly. Behind it, two more snarled and clawed their way through the wreckage. "Scout!" Jake shouted, pulling his sidearm and firing at the lead creature. The bullets barely slowed it, its translucent skin rippling as it charged. "Access granted," Scout 8 announced, the panel sliding open to reveal a narrow passage. Jake didn't hesitate. He fired two more shots, forcing the creatures to flinch, then dove into the passage. Scout 8 zipped in after him, and the panel slammed shut just as claws raked against it. The passage sloped upward, the air growing colder with each step. "Where does this lead?" Jake asked, his voice echoing. "Emergency surface egress," Scout 8 replied. "But it's not unguarded." Jake's jaw tightened. "Of course it isn't." The passage sloped steeply upward, every step pulling Jake closer to the surface and farther from the horrors below. The air grew colder with each meter, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and metallic tang from the facility's decaying infrastructure. Scout 8's light flickered faintly in the narrow corridor, scanning the path ahead. "The emergency surface egress is 300 meters ahead," the drone announced. "Hostile signatures detected near the exit." "Define hostile, Scout," Jake muttered, gripping his sidearm tightly. "Unidentified, genetically modified subjects," Scout replied. Quantity, 2. Location, within 20 meters of the hatch. Jake's grip tightened. Fantastic. How long until this place goes into full lockdown? Facility lockdown in 7 minutes, Scout said. Ventilation neutralization protocols will follow. Jake cursed under his breath, picking up his pace. His boots scraped against the metal floor, the narrow corridor vibrating faintly with the tremors from the failing systems below. He couldn't afford to waste time, but the thought of running headfirst into whatever waited at the exit chilled him to the bone. The corridor finally widened, opening into a small chamber with reinforced metal walls. Ahead was the emergency hatch, a massive circular door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Frost clung to its surface, glinting under Scout 8's light. Jake crouched behind a rusted pipe, his breathing shallow as he assessed the situation. Beyond the hatch, faint movements flickered in the dim light, a pair of figures pacing back and forth, their distorted forms casting warped shadows on the walls. One of them was hunched over, its spine arched unnaturally high, sharp protrusions jutting from its back like twisted branches. The other was taller, its limbs elongated, its head twitching erratically as it sniffed the air. Both creatures glowed faintly, their veins pulsing with the same alien light Jake had seen in the cryostasis chambers. "They're guarding the exit," Jake whispered. "Any chance we can sneak past them?" "Unlikely," Scout replied. "They appear to be reacting to vibrations and changes in temperature. Stealth approach would require thermal suppression." Jake sighed. "So no." "Got it." He checked his pack, pulling out a small EMP grenade he'd brought for emergencies. It wouldn't kill the creatures, but it might buy him enough time to reach the hatch. "Scout, can you unlock that thing?" Jake asked, nodding toward the hatch. "Yes," the drone replied, "but it will require 30 seconds of uninterrupted access." Jake grimaced. 30 seconds is a long time when you're being hunted. He pulled the pin on the grenade and tossed it toward the creatures. It bounced once, then detonated with a burst of blue light, sending a pulse of energy rippling through the chamber. The creatures recoiled, their glowing veins flickering erratically as they stumbled backward. "Now!" Jake shouted. Scout 8 zipped toward the hatch, its light flickering as it interfaced with the locking mechanism. Jake sprinted across the chamber, his sidearm raised as the creatures recovered. The taller one let out a shriek, its limbs snapping forward unnaturally as it lunged toward him. Jake fired 3 rounds into its chest, the bullets punching through its translucent skin and forcing it to stagger. The hunched creature followed, scuttling across the walls like a spider, its claws scraping against the metal. 15 seconds, Scout 8 said, its voice calm despite the chaos. Jake dodged a swipe from the second creature, the claws narrowly missing his face. He ducked under its next attack and fired point blank into its side, the force of the impact sending it crashing to the floor. The taller creature screeched again, its glowing eyes locking onto Jake. It charged, faster this time, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally. Jake emptied his clip into it, each shot slowing it, but not stopping it. 5 seconds, Scout 8 announced. The hatch let out a loud hiss as it unlocked, the circular door grinding open to reveal the snowy wilderness beyond. Cold air rushed into the chamber, stinging Jake's face as he sprinted toward the opening. The creatures lunged after him, their shrieks echoing through the narrow space. Jake dove through the hatch just as it began to close, the heavy door sealing with a final, deafening clang. He collapsed into the snow outside, gasping for air as the facility trembled below. Scout 8 hovered beside him, its light scanning the tree line. "Surface reached," the drone said. "Lockdown initiated below." Jake sat up, the cold seeping through his clothes as he stared at the hatch. Faint vibrations ran through the ground, the sounds of machinery and distant screams muffled by layers of earth. "They're trapped down there," Jake muttered, his voice hollow. "For now," Scout 8 replied. Jake's eyes scanned the dense forest around him. He wasn't safe yet. The bitter wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone and smoke. Jake stood knee-deep in the snow, his breath fogging the icy air as he surveyed the dense forest ahead. The hatch behind him was silent now, buried beneath the frosted earth, but he knew better than to think he was safe. Scout 8 hovered at his shoulder, its lights dimmed to avoid detection. "Thermal scans indicate no immediate hostiles in the vicinity," it reported. However, residual power fluctuations suggest some subjects may have escaped the facility prior to lockdown. Jake adjusted the strap of his pack, his hollow recorder pressing uncomfortably against his back. "You're telling me they're already out here?" "Correct," Scout replied. 3 unidentified thermal signatures detected within a 500-meter radius. Movement patterns suggest hunting behavior. Jake's stomach churned. He wasn't just running anymore. He was being tracked. His mind raced as he scanned the surrounding forest, searching for a path through the dense trees. The snow muffled his movements, but it also made him easier to track. "We need higher ground," Jake muttered. "Somewhere to see them before they see us." Scout 8 pinged softly, projecting a 3D map of the terrain onto Jake's visor. "There is an elevated ridge approximately 300 meters north. Recommend proceeding cautiously." Jake nodded, gripping his sidearm tightly as he began to move. Each step crunched through the snow, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the grey sky. The forest felt alive, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch setting Jake's nerves on edge. He knew the creatures were out there, watching, waiting. They weren't human anymore, if they ever had been. They were predators now, designed to hunt, to adapt. Scout 8's voice broke the silence. "Thermal signature approaching from the south. Distance, 150 meters. Movement, rapid." Jake froze, his pulse spiking. He crouched low behind a fallen tree, his eyes scanning the forest for movement. "Can you identify it?" "Subject appears humanoid," Scout said. "Physical anomalies consistent with prior observations. Aggression levels, high." Jake gritted his teeth, gripping his sidearm as a shadow moved between the trees. It was fast, darting in and out of the foliage, its distorted form barely visible. Suddenly, a guttural snarl shattered the silence, and the creature lunged into view. Its body was a grotesque fusion of muscle and bone, its elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. Its glowing eyes locked onto Jake, and it charged, snow spraying in its wake. Jake fired instinctively, the shots echoing through the forest. The bullets struck the creature's torso, slowing it but not stopping it. It let out a deafening roar, leaping over the fallen tree and slamming into the ground where Jake had been seconds earlier. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws. The creature swiped again, its movements unnaturally fast and jerky. Jake fired 2 more shots into its chest, but it kept coming, its glowing veins pulsing erratically. "Scout! Options!" Jake shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Northwest, ridge ahead," the drone replied. "Elevation advantage available. Warning, second hostile approaching." Jake didn't wait. He turned and bolted through the trees, his breath ragged as the creature roared behind him. The snow made every step a struggle, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The ridge came into view, a steep, rocky incline that jutted out over the forest. Jake scrambled up the slope, his hands slipping on the icy rocks. Behind him, the first creature tore through the undergrowth, followed closely by a second, larger figure. "2 of them now," Jake muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "Great." He reached the top of the ridge and spun around, his sidearm raised. The creatures charged up the incline, their glowing eyes locked onto him. Jake fired, each shot striking true, but doing little more than slowing their advance. "Scout, can we hold this position?" "Negative," the drone replied. "Hostiles will overwhelm within 30 seconds. Suggest alternative strategy. Destabilize terrain." Jake's eyes darted to the loose rocks lining the edge of the ridge. It was risky, but it was all he had. He aimed at the base of the largest boulder and fired, the shots kicking up snow and dirt. The first creature lunged just as the boulder gave way. The ground beneath it crumbled, and the creature let out a guttural roar as it tumbled backward, taking the second one with it. Both fell down the slope, crashing into the forest below in a flurry of snow and snapping branches. Jake stood at the edge, his chest heaving as he stared down at the motionless forms. "That'll slow them down," he muttered. "For now," Scout 8 said. However, thermal scans indicate additional hostiles closing in. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath fogging in the cold air. The ridge wasn't safe for long, he needed to keep moving. "Let's find a way out of here," he said, turning back toward the forest. The ridge sloped downward into denser forest, the canopy above thickening to blot out what little sunlight broke through the overcast sky. Jake trudged through the snow, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step was a gamble. The terrain was uneven, his boots slipping on patches of ice buried beneath the snow. "Scout, what's our status?" Jake asked, his voice low and tight. "Thermal signatures detected," Scout 8 replied, its light flickering as it scanned the area. 3 hostiles closing in, 2 from the west, 1 from the southeast. Distance, approximately 200 meters. Jake's pulse quickened. "They're boxing me in." "Affirmative. Hostiles appear to be coordinating movements," Scout 8 said. Recommendation: increase pace. Jake pressed forward, weaving between the trees. His pack felt heavier now, the hollow recorder inside bumping against his back with every step. He gritted his teeth. He had what he came for, proof of the lab's experiments, but survival felt like a distant dream. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. Snow swirled around him, reducing visibility to mere meters. The sound of snapping branches echoed faintly in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. "They're herding me," Jake muttered under his breath. "Correct," Scout 8 replied. "Hostile trajectory suggests intended interception." Jake scanned the forest, his mind racing. He needed a way to break their pattern, something unpredictable. His eyes landed on a shallow ravine cutting through the forest floor. The walls were steep, the ground below littered with jagged rocks, but it offered cover. "That'll do," he said, veering toward the ravine. As he approached the edge, the first creature burst from the tree line, its glowing eyes locking onto him. This one was different, larger, faster. Its elongated limbs propelled it forward with terrifying speed, its claws slicing through the air. Jake dove into the ravine, sliding down the icy slope as the creature roared behind him. He hit the bottom hard, his shoulder slamming into a rock. Pain shot through him, but he scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing ache. The creature leapt into the ravine, landing with a deafening thud. Its glowing veins pulsed erratically, its malformed body twisting as it sniffed the air. Jake backed away slowly, his sidearm raised. "Scout, options," he hissed. "Ravine extends east," the drone replied. "Potential escape route 300 meters ahead." Jake fired a warning shot, the sound echoing off the ravine walls. The creature flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a guttural snarl and lunged. Jake ducked, the creature's claws raking the air inches above his head. He fired again, this time hitting its torso. The impact staggered it, but it recovered quickly, its movements jerky and inhuman. Before the creature could attack again, a second figure dropped into the ravine. This one was smaller but no less menacing, its elongated limbs twitching as it circled Jake. "2 hostiles now," Scout 8 reported. Jake backed toward the eastern edge of the ravine, his mind racing. The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. Desperation kicked in. Jake pulled a flare from his pack, igniting it with a snap. The bright, burning light illuminated the ravine, casting harsh shadows on the creatures. They recoiled, hissing as the flare's heat and brightness overwhelmed their senses. Jake used the distraction to sprint toward the ravine's exit, the flare held high in one hand and his sidearm in the other. "Path clear ahead," Scout 8 said. Jake didn't stop, the sound of the creature's snarls echoing behind him. He could feel their presence closing in, their movements faster and more erratic now. The ravine opened into a clearing, the snow-covered ground giving way to frozen grass. In the distance, Jake spotted the faint outline of an old ranger station, a weathered structure barely visible through the swirling snow. "There!" Jake shouted, his voice hoarse. Scout 8 scanned the area. Structure detected. No heat signatures inside, likely abandoned. "It doesn't need to be safe," Jake muttered, sprinting toward it. "Just needs to be defensible." The creatures burst into the clearing behind him, their glowing veins blazing like molten rivers in the dim light. Jake fired blindly over his shoulder, the shots slowing them but not stopping them. He reached the station and threw himself against the door, forcing it open. Inside, the air was bitterly cold. the walls lined with broken shelves and rusted tools. Jake slammed the door shut, wedging a metal bar into the handle to secure it. The snarls outside grew louder as the creatures clawed at the walls, their inhuman strength rattling the fragile structure. "Scout, give me options," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Building integrity insufficient for prolonged defense," the drone replied. "Hostiles will breach in less than 1 minute." Jake scanned the room, his eyes landing on an old fuel canister tucked into a corner. An idea formed in his mind. Dangerous, reckless, but his only shot. "Then let's make it count," he said, grabbing the canister. The ranger station groaned under the assault of the creatures outside. Clawed hands scraped against the walls, and their guttural snarls vibrated through the thin, rusted metal. Jake worked quickly, his hands trembling as he wrestled with the ancient fuel canister he'd found in the corner. It was heavy, the liquid sloshing faintly inside. "Scout, can I use this as an explosive?" Jake asked, his voice tight. The drone hovered close, scanning the canister. "Fuel type detected, diesel. Highly flammable but not inherently explosive. Recommend combination with ignition source for controlled detonation." Jake glanced at the flare in his hand, the red flame sputtering faintly. "This'll have to do." Outside, the creatures grew more frenzied, their glowing eyes glaring through gaps in the station's boarded windows. The larger one let out a deafening roar and slammed its massive body against the door, causing the hinges to groan and bend. "They're breaking through," Jake muttered. "Hostile breach in 20 seconds, Scout 8 confirmed. Jake dragged the fuel canister toward the center of the room, tipping it over to spill its contents onto the floor. The pungent smell of diesel filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of fear and sweat. He smeared a line of fuel leading to the door and stepped back, placing the flare in the center of the puddle. "Scout, tell me there's an escape route." "Structure contains a rear ventilation hatch," the drone replied, projecting its location onto Jake's visor. "Hatch is corroded but functional." "Great," Jake said, rushing toward the back of the station. He knelt by the hatch, his fingers scrabbling at the rusted bolts holding it in place. The sound of splintering wood behind him sent a chill down his spine. The door burst inward, fragments flying across the room as the larger creature barreled inside. Its glowing veins pulsed erratically, its twisted body hunched as it sniffed the air. Behind it, the smaller creature slithered through the gap, its elongated limbs skittering across the floor like a spider. Jake yanked the final bolt free and shoved the hatch open. The freezing wind howled in, carrying snow into the room. He glanced over his shoulder as the creatures prowled closer, their glowing eyes fixed on him. "Hey!" Jake shouted, grabbing their attention. He pointed his sidearm at the flare resting in the puddle of diesel. "Come and get me, you bastards!" The creatures lunged, their movements a blur of inhuman speed. Jake fired a single shot, hitting the flare dead center. The spark ignited the fuel and the room erupted into a wall of fire. The blast knocked Jake backward, the heat searing his face as he scrambled through the hatch. The creatures howled in agony, their glowing veins flaring brightly before collapsing into embers. The fire consumed the station, the flames clawing at the walls as the structure groaned under the heat. Jake tumbled into the snow outside, rolling to extinguish the sparks clinging to his jacket. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the sound of the roaring fire drowning out everything else. "Hostiles neutralized," Scout 8 said, hovering above him. "Structural collapse imminent. Recommend moving to a safe distance." Jake forced himself to his feet, his legs shaky as he stumbled away from the burning station. He turned back just in time to see the roof cave in, the flames swallowing the last remnants of the creatures and the station's secrets. The forest was silent now, the snow falling gently around him. The fire crackled in the distance, a faint orange glow against the darkening sky. "You think they'll send more of those things after me?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "Unknown," Scout replied. "However, the loss of the facility may delay further operations." Jake nodded, his thoughts racing. He'd uncovered the truth, recorded the horrors hidden beneath the Alaskan wilderness, and survived. But at what cost? The escaped hybrids, the implications of the experiments. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. "We need to get this footage to someone who can do something about it," Jake said, clutching his pack tightly. "Agreed," Scout replied. "Nearest population center is 15 kilometers south." Jake sighed, exhaustion weighing on him as he turned toward the distant tree line. "Let's get moving." 2 weeks later, the footage Jake recorded leaked online. The horrifying images of cryostasis pods, alien-human hybrids, and twisted experiments spread like wildfire. Conspiracy theories erupted overnight, some calling it a hoax, others demanding answers. Jake watched the chaos unfold from a safe house, his face illuminated by the glow of his tablet. Scout 8 hovered silently nearby, its scanners monitoring the room for threats. "Think they'll believe it?" Jake asked, sipping a mug of cold coffee. "Initial response indicates skepticism," Scout said. "However, public demand for investigation is growing." Jake set the mug down, his expression grim. "They'll bury it," he said. "Like they always do. But at least now people know." The newsfeed on his tablet updated, showing a breaking report. "Unexplained attacks in Alaskan wilderness. Authorities investigating." Jake's chest tightened. He clicked the story, his stomach sinking as he read the details. Hikers missing, strange sightings near abandoned facilities, authorities claiming it was wildlife. "They're out there," he said quietly. Scout 8 didn't respond. Jake leaned back, staring out the window at the falling snow. The fight wasn't over. The hybrids were loose, the lab's experiments scattered, and the government was silent. But for now, he'd done what he could, and he'd be ready for what came next.